I'm doing the reading today. The gospel is Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, one that I'm sure that we all are familiar with. This is a time when Jesus has been starting his ministry, and he has performed some miracles already, including saving his disciples on the lake. And now he has come back to land on the other side of the lake. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there and had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing that it had been her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus said, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brothers of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was about 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to tell anyone or let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. So ended the reading.
Thank you, Al and Bruce and all of the deacons who worked to give Doretta a little vacation this week. So when Myra said she was having trouble finding somebody to fill in, I said we could do the service ourselves. That would be all right. I thought maybe she'd give the message. But she took my offer as volunteering to do this, so here I am. I want to lean into this gospel story a little bit because one of the things I find really fascinating about reading the New Testament is to just read very slowly and put yourself there, sort of immerse yourself in the scene through the lens of the culture and the time and the place. And this story just has so much to it. I thought it might be fun to go on that journey and see what insights we could find. Of all the written records that commemorate the life of Jesus, the Gospel of Mark stands out for emphasizing miracles, much more than the other synoptic Gospels. So contextually, as Al mentioned, the story we just heard is sort of the dramatic ending sequence of 4 superhuman feats carried out by Jesus, all in a day's work. So first, after he speaks to this large crowd, they're near Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, by the way. You can Google Maps these places today. Still, this is Lake Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. So they're by the shore, and there's so many people there that Jesus has to go out a little ways in a boat so that they can hear him, you know. And I was thinking about that in our own outdoor service. We wouldn't need a microphone if we did it over on Kyoka and let the water be a natural amplifier. So Jesus, after he's done speaking to the crowds in the evening, he decides that he and his disciples will take the boat across to the other side of the lake. And if you were here last week, or if you know this story, you'll remember a big storm comes up while Jesus is sleeping. And the crew is fearful for their lives. So they wake him up to seek his counsel. They say, aren't you going to do anything about this? And just with 3 words, Jesus calms the storm. But the crew, they're still fearful. And Jesus asks them, he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So they get to the other side of the lake, and over there they meet a man who's possessed by demons, who begs Jesus for help. Now this is one of the Bible's more bizarre moments, and the lectionary, I noticed, skipped over it. So Jesus, instead of just simply saying, demons be gone, he somehow is able to communicate with these demons directly, or the impure spirits as they're referred to. And instead of him ordering them, by the way it's written in the gospel, the impure spirits ask Jesus to be taken out of the man and put into a herd of pigs. Remember this story? Is there a little familiarity in this? And then subsequently, Jesus facilitates this transfer somehow, and then the pigs all go and drown themselves in the lake. So this is interesting, and the man is left free from his affliction of these demons, and he begs Jesus to go back across the lake with him and become one of the disciples. But Jesus has a different plan for this guy. He says, no, I want you to stay here and go back to your people and tell them what the Lord has done for you. Okay, so we've got 2 miracles within hours of one another. And with these 2 miracles, Jesus, first he demonstrates that he has power over the natural world by controlling the weather, and then he demonstrates his ability to manipulate the unnatural world by outsmarting these invisible demons. After calming the sea, he asks his followers if they're still afraid, and he inquires about the state of their faith, right? He says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And after driving out the demons, he requests that the story be told in that land. Because remember, they're across the lake now, and this is a country where people are less familiar with Jesus and his teachings. So they cross back over the Sea of Galilee to the other side of the lake, and you might imagine at this point how bewildered the disciples with him might have felt about the things that they've witnessed over the last couple of hours. But this day was far from over. The 2 stories that follow it, of Jesus healing the woman in the street and raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, these stories are inextricably linked together. And as such, they encapsulate the human condition. They run the gamut from fear to faith, from sickness to health, desperation to joy, and ultimately from death to life. And if you go through and you look for what's this story about, is there a topic here? You find it's a story about healing. And you find it's a story about inclusion, because you notice the different lots in life from the woman to Jairus' family. It's a story about hope. It's a story about compassion. It's a story about perseverance. It's a story about telling the whole truth, as he asks the woman who's been healed to do. It's certainly a story about Christ's divinity. It's a story about not being afraid to ask for help. And maybe most of all, it's a story about faith, and about how faith can be a pathway out of fear. I thought about this and I thought, gosh, I can only give one message, but I can see how a pastor could have job security for a long time with a story like this. So they get back across the Sea of Galilee, uneventfully this time, and there's still a crowd gathered because Jesus knew how to leave an audience wanting more. And this man Jairus is there waiting for Jesus. And Jairus is a well-known, important man. He's a ruler of the synagogue at Capernaum. So we could imagine in an equivalency of cultures that he'd be like a governor or a senator would be in this time and place. And this very important man, Jairus, prostrates himself in front of Jesus, pleading with Jesus that he come visit his 12-year-old daughter, and that by some miracle Jesus can save her. We can assume from the context here that Jairus was frantic and impatient. Presumably he'd been waiting all night and part of the day for Jesus to return. He'd have expected Jesus to finish his talk the evening before and row the boat back over, right? That's probably when he decided that this man might have the power to do something about his daughter. But instead, no, Jesus has headed off in the other direction. He's had an overnight vacation. He's been controlling the rain, and he's been drawing out demons. But even after all this, Jesus goes with Jairus. But then, another detour. From out of this crowd, Jesus feels someone touch him. And hundreds of people were probably grabbing at him. I imagine this to be like a celebrity walking down the red carpet where everybody's trying to, touch their sleeve. And so Jesus is walking through a sea of his fans here. But the gospel writer notes at this stage that Jesus felt the power go out from him. So Jesus pauses, taken by surprise. And how often does that happen in all the scriptures? How often is Jesus surprised? But he didn't really perform this miracle consciously. He felt the power go out from him, and he knew something had happened. He understood. So we'll pause here a moment at this story, because there's just so much in this moment. First of all, who is this woman? Here's what we know. She's been suffering from bleeding for 12 years, it says. Now, from clues going back into the Greek language version, we can surmise that her bleeding wasn't a natural bleeding. It was probably caused by some type of hemorrhage. And additionally, it says she suffered a great deal under many doctors. I thought about this because we only have this little moment with this woman in the story, but she's had 12 years of absolute agony, and I just wanted to sit with that to understand where she was coming from in this moment. So I thought, what was medicine like in these times? What was she enduring? And we have the first encyclopedia of natural history was written by a Roman elder named Pliny. And he lived from the year 23 to the year 79. Like 23, 2,000 years ago. And he wrote an encyclopedia of natural history. So from it, we learn that doctors of this era were prescribing some pretty pretty curious concoctions. Things like ashes of burnt wolf's skull, stag's horns, heads of mice, the eyes of crabs, owls' brains, the livers of frogs, and other such things. Here's one for you. For dysentery, the prescription was ground horse's teeth. And if you had a head cold, you could cure it by kissing a mule's nose. So, from contemporaneous Jewish writings, particularly the Talmud, which was the first writing down of Jewish oral history, and this happened around the same time as the story today, we find some cures that this unfortunate woman would have probably been subjected to. One remedy consisted of drinking a goblet of wine containing a powder compounded from rubber, alum, and garden crocuses. Another treatment consisted of a dose of Persian onions cooked in wine and administered with the summons, "Arise out of your flow of blood." Other physicians prescribed sudden shock, or the carrying of the ash of an ostrich's egg in a certain cloth. Could you imagine 12 years of going through these things? And to add insult to injury, literally, this woman was subjected to tremendous social pressure. The nature of her illness fell under the stipulations of Leviticus, whereby she'd have been pronounced unclean. So she'd be an outcast. She couldn't participate in religious life or community life. And apparently she was also forced to be separated from her husband. And on top of that, she'd lost all of her financial resources. The gospel writer notes that she'd spent all of her money on doctor bills with no relief. Presumably the cure was worse than the disease. So as a last resort, probably assuming she'd be caught and stoned to death, she goes out into the public square with the idea that if she could just sneak a touch of Jesus' clothing, and she knows she can't touch him because that's against the law of Leviticus, she would defile him and make him unclean in a public place. But she thinks if she could just touch his clothes, she'll be freed from her illness and from this whole situation. And miraculously, she was absolutely right. Verse 29 says, immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And Jesus might have been just as surprised by this chain of events as the newly healed woman, because notice he gives her credit for this miracle. He doesn't take the credit even. He says, your faith has made you well. Meanwhile, poor Jairus. Jesus' overnight boat adventure and this now unexpected encounter with the woman in the streets taken too much time. People have come to intercept the procession. They've come from Jairus' home, and they told him, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? Jesus overheard this said to him, and he turned and he said, don't be afraid, just believe. Wow. Quite a change from the tone a few hours ago in the boat, right? What, do you got no faith? Do you still not believe? No. Jesus, the guy famous for answering questions with questions and spitting yarns and creating riddles for us to think about and solve through the ages, momentarily, the same Jesus adopts the language of the angels, right? Think about all the other times in the Bible you hear, don't be afraid. The angel's appearance to Mary, then later to the shepherds in the Christmas story. The angel at the empty tomb when the stone was rolled away. Angels are the ones who say, don't be afraid. It's all of the most miraculous and extraordinary moments of the Bible where we hear these words. And this one's going to turn out to be no exception to that, right? So they go to the house anyway, And here we find another chaotic scene at the house. Put yourself there. There's a crowd of people weeping and wailing loudly. Now, at this time, the volume and the intensity of mourning was viewed as an indicator of the great love for the deceased. So, the Mishnah says, even the poorest in Israel do not hire less than 2 flute players and 1 wailing woman. Now, if that's what the poor folks were doing for a death in the home at the time, imagine somebody as powerful as Jairus, somebody like a governor. You know, he'd have all sorts of people there mourning the death of his daughter. So this is the commotion that Jesus comes into. And here comes Jesus, he says, why are you making a commotion? Why are you weeping? The child's not dead, just sleeping. Could you imagine how laughed at and ridiculed? She's been dead for long enough to go out and hire these people to come in and start the ritual. And we know what happens next. Jesus brings just the child's parents into the room where her body is, and 3 disciples. And he takes her hand. He takes the little girl's hand and he tells her to get up. So, different from the 3 miracles earlier this day that were very public, this is much more private, much more personal. We can probably surmise that he wouldn't have wanted everyone in the region with a recently deceased loved one to be beating a path to his door. And we can fairly confidently assume that Jesus wasn't quietly making up for being too late by performing a miracle he hadn't intended. Note the quote that I put at the very beginning of the bulletin. In African American culture, there's something referred to as slave wisdom. And that are these proverbs, sayings from the enslaved elders of the African American community. And one of them is, God may not come when you call him, but he'll always be there right on time. It's even turned into 2 different gospel songs over the years. And I thought of that. I thought of that song in this moment. That God may not come when you call him, but he's always right on time. He told the household and mourners they were mistaken, that the girl was only sleeping. And only the girl's parents and the 3 disciples got to be in there. And what they saw, culturally speaking, Jesus breaks the law of Leviticus yet again this day because he touches the dead girl, who, by the law, is unclean. And these people witness that. And then the miracle that she's restored to life and she gets up and she walks around. Presumably, the purpose of bringing in 3 disciples with him was to witness this girl's resurrection, preparing them with some kind of context for what would eventually happen to Jesus and showing his calm, thoughtful, intimate relationship with death and life following death. He prepares these disciples so that they'll be able to comprehend better later when the inevitable happens to him. In reflecting on these 2 healings of very different women, I notice Jesus' kindness, first to the woman in the street. He presses her to come forward and to tell the truth about what happened. And then he publicly declares her free of her affliction. She was healed the moment she touched his garment, but this extra step that Jesus takes of rooting her out of the crowd and having her admit what she had done and who she was, who she had been, and then very publicly declaring her healed, this enabled her to rejoin society and to no longer be an outcast. If he had just let her slip away with this sort of accidental or incidental miracle, she would have still been considered an outcast. But he takes that extra step to make sure that she can go back into public life. She won't need to be an outcast anymore. And then for the little girl, the first thing he does is he instructs the people in the household to get her something to eat. So the gospel writer portrays Jesus not only as a God of infinite power, but as a God of infinite compassion. Jesus is really deeply touched by the human needs in the story, right down to the smallest detail of the fact that the little girl had missed her dinner. I think also worthy of a footnote in this story is the Greek word sozo. Jairus, this word is used in the Greek version, in the Greek translation of this, several times, and in all the cases through the story, a different form of this word sozo is used. Jairus begs that Jesus might come and solve his daughter. Same root word. He says to the woman in the street, "Daughter, your faith has sesoken you." Sozo, the word, can refer to healing or to delivery from danger. But the Greek translation of the Old Testament often also uses the word to refer to the salvation of the Israelites. And in the New Testament, Paul uses it repeatedly to refer to Christian salvation. So with this little linguistic clue in the story, we can read this two ways. We can read these two events as stories of healing, but also we could read them as stories of total and complete salvation. And finally, the key component to emerge from this whirlwind 24 hours in the life of Jesus is faith. Starting in the boat, when Jesus, back to his signature style, asks, "Why are you afraid? Do you have no faith?" And then we've got the faith of the man from the other side of the lake, possessed by mysterious demons, who had the courage to ask Jesus for help. And the extreme faith of the bleeding woman, faith that was strong enough to save her. And the extraordinary and patient faith of Jairus, who was the first person to be told, "Don't be afraid, just believe." Fear could be overcome by faith. It could bring salvation. I think about freedom in this story. We've got Independence Day, 4th of July coming up this week. Freedom, that word will come up so much. There's a man freed from his demons in this story, a woman freed from her pain and isolation, a girl freed from the clutches of death. As you can probably tell, I'm much more comfortable with history and language than I am with finding wisdom in the scripture and bringing it into our everyday lives. That's what our Reverend Doretta is just so good at. But one thing I do ponder in response to today's gospel story is the bit that didn't get written. The man on the opposite shore and the woman in the street, Jairus' daughter, that day they all began new lives, transformed lives. One day this happened. Everyone who witnessed Jesus do these things was affected. I ponder that idea of a transformed life, the idea of freedom as it relates to healing wounds or illnesses and ultimately leading to God's salvation. Ditching fear for faith freed these people from the things that were holding them back. Extreme as they were in these cases, storms, demons, severe illnesses, even death. And I thought perhaps this advice of don't be afraid, just believe, is maybe the ticket to our own lives being transformed in ways we haven't even yet imagined. I know I'll continue to ponder these things each time I hear these gospel stories, and I hope you'll ponder them too. The idea of a life transformed by faith over fear reminded me of the 18th century cleric John Newton. Anybody know him? I'll bet you do. He was a rough and tumble sailor. He was the captain of a slave ship. And during his life, he underwent a deep spiritual transformation. He became a staunch abolitionist and later in life an Anglican priest. He wrote the lyrics to Amazing Grace that we're about to sing in a minute. But in addition to writing those lyrics to Amazing Grace, he also wrote this little tidbit about the personal transformation in his own life that God was bringing about. And I thought it would be a good prelude to Amazing Grace. Newton said, "I'm not what I ought to be. I'm not what I want to be. I'm not what I hope to be in another world. But still, I'm not what I once used to be. And by the grace of God, I am what I am."
Wow.
A life transformed. Join me with Amazing Grace.
Terrific.